The next speaker is John Hamilton. He is going to talk about two fundamentally different ways of seeing the book, the philology of the body and the philology of the flesh. The philology of the body is based on the premise of separability. It sees the content of a book as separate from its material form. This philology prefers the content over form and sees the material object as something that can be discarded. This is possible because the immaterial soul of the book is simply housed within the material physical form of the book. In contrast, the other philology, the philology of the flesh, does not see content and its physical form as two separate things, but as one. Its central notion is incarnation. The word becomes flesh and cannot be separated from it.
I think this dematerializing practice is better construed, however, as a philology of the body, right? One that posits the complete separateness or separability of the soul and its corporeal vessel. And it's this separability or separateness that encourages the privileging of content over form or medium. According to this premise of separability, meaning, or the very soul of the text, remains integral and intact because it is simply housed within the confines of the book, within the physical limits of the corpus. And it's based on the separability of the soul and the body that the book's meaning can ultimately be detached from its perishable container and then migrate, right, from one place, its material manifestation, to another place, to the soul, to the mind, to the storage center. It's like the Pythagorean notion of metempsychosis, right, where the separation of the ideational expressed from its bodily expression is understood as a purification, as the restoration of true and real being, a being that is no longer compromised by any finite or contingent conditions. And so the philology of the body loves language and expresses this love by liberating meaning from base, corruptible mediation. Like the philology of the body, the philology of the flesh also loves language, and it loves words, and it loves texts, but this love denies the separateness of the soul and the body. It denies the separability of the logos from its physical form. It doesn't rely on a theory of embodiment. It doesn't rely on the idea that the idea is housed or embodied in a body that is ultimately discardable. Rather, it proceeds according to a notion of what has to be called incarnation. And of course, by incarnation, I'm referring to the famous prologue of the Gospel of John, not me, but the disciple John, where the word, the logos, becomes flesh, or sarx. Simply put, by distinguishing a philology of the body from a philology of the flesh, I want to indicate these two fundamentally different approaches to the written word. On the one hand, a philology that construes the book as a corporeal object, containing a meaningful soul within, the separability paradigm, and on the other hand, a philology that refuses to tear meaning and mediating form apart. I don't want to press for any evaluative or normative issues, but I would simply like to maintain this somewhat schematic distinction as heuristic, which can then help us to consider the book as body as opposed to the book as flesh. And on this basis, then, I would like to ask whether this distinction can tell us something about the enduring presence of the book in a digital age. What if we regard digitization as a mode of disincarnation, as a procedure designed for transforming the flesh into a body? And what if we see certain gestures done with technological advancement as ways to recarnalize the technology? What if we can talk about the distinctions between the two according to this schema? Would we be compelled to acknowledge some adherence to the flesh's recalcitrance, which might explain a persistent desire for these carnalizing effects, both in print culture and in the digital culture?
As you just heard, John Hamilton wants to use the distinction between these two philologies as a way to look at the position of the book in our digital age. In the following few minutes, he'll continue on this subject. He will argue that today's digitization is motivated by the philology of the body because it produces completely immaterial texts. It disembodies the word. That is why digital books do not simply replace printed books, but rather realize the highest hopes that have always been associated with publication, according to Hamilton. The downside of this dematerialization is that the physical form of the book is lost. Hamilton points out that digitization is now trying to compensate this loss. He calls this carnalizing tendencies.
Granting privilege to immaterial sense at the expense of its material conditions is the hallmark of what I'm calling the philology of the body. Its method demands that a text be read through, that the material substrate of verbal communication can be dissolved. And to this end, the philology of the body sponsors productions that are eminently readable, portable, accessible, and perfectly transparent. And today's digitizing endeavors, which provide us with weightless and virtually intangible texts, are motivated by the same intentions. Like Kafka's nightmarish technological wonder, electronic devices strive to disembody the word, to disencumber language from its material and potentially bothersome basis. Digital books, therefore, do not simply replace printed books, rather they seem to realize many of the highest hopes that have always been associated with publication, offering a readership nearly infinite possibilities of accessibility, a weightless, disembodied storehouse of unlimited material that barely takes up any space at all, texts that are all the closer to the classical ideal of immaterial sense. All the same, the economy of human experience teaches us that gain in one domain is consistently accompanied by loss in another. Clearly enough, what is lost in digitization is the physical bulkiness of the book, the bookishness that Kiene refers to, the binding, the dust cover, the opaque pages, the dark ink, and so forth. That is, those material items which, from an enlightened perspective, contribute little to the constitution of the text's immaterial sense. In this philology of the body, in this approach that focuses entirely on ascertaining some transcendent meaning, these immanent parasemantic aspects of the book are indeed dispensable. And I think readers are generally torn between these two philological approaches or premises, between the need for signification on the one hand and a desire for flesh on the other. We certainly read for meaning, but we also hold on to some idea that regards literature as a physical manifestation linked to incarnate existence, to the lives of authors and readers. Printed books have long cultivated practices that encourage the belief in the writer's trace. Digitization, also strives to animate the letter by including vivid illustrations, interactive links, multiple hypertexts, touch screen technology, etc. And these sensual gestures, or what I would call carnalizing tendencies, try to compensate what I think is a felt loss of the flesh, something that can be regarded perhaps as vestigial practices that reach back to an era even before Gutenberg.
What will happen in the future, nobody knows. Landow, Pressman and Bielstein will tell about their views on the future of the book. Will the traditional book survive, or is the e-book that should feel threatened? Will the book simply change its form, or will it exist like it always has?
Well, I tend to think there's I'm really very worried about the permanency of digital media because, I suspect that there are going to be giant caves under mountains where people will store paper printouts, code that could be in case something happens, the degradation of a lot of the computer material, or some other, microscopic form that doesn't, degrade, because our present storage mechanisms are so have such short lives. I mean, to put in a CD-ROM that still is supposed to work with your system. I'm not even talking about things that don't work with your system. And find that it doesn't work anymore is really horrifying. And I have so many interesting projects that were done by various designers and things in the early 1990s that I want to show people today. like this one, but I had to get an old machine and then find a way to, to use some software to make a recording of it rather than just play it. And this is really, absolutely maddening. Some of the finest examples I had, aren't around anymore. And so it seems to me one of the fields that's got to happen is that of computer archaeology. People have computer museums. We've got to create simulation environments. And we also, and that's the secondary thing. The primary thing is we really have to find a way to record, because what's going to happen is all the earlier kinds of things that disappear with everybody else are going to disappear with us. And there won't even be an occasional flyer inside, used as a fish wrapper inside someone's book or, found in, it'll all just be nothing. So I really do think that, one solution to the problems of memory is forgetting, but the other problem is actually remembering and trying to find a way to do it. I think that's one of the most serious things. And so this is why you can never really badmouth a book, because as long as you can keep it from burning or getting too mildewed, it's still usable.
I think the novel as we know it is changing. Actually, we were talking about Mark McGurl's recent book, and one of the things that he wrote more recently, he describes the zombie renaissance. There's like this really interesting renaissance of zombies and discussion of them everywhere. And I kind of see this bookish stuff as kind of zombies. It's like focused on the book, like the supposedly dead but undead. And one of the things that he points out is, well, what does this mean for the novel, particularly in a post-human age when novels were supposed to represent, they were supposed to represent the enlightened interior subject. The realist novel represents the human. Well, what happens in the post-human age when we're cybernetic beings and our minds are distributed? What kinds of novels do we get? So the question of, is the literary going to die? No, because it's this category and the novel, it's called the novel because it's about being new, always reinventing itself. But the interesting thing is the question of what the changes in media do to that genre and expectations of it.
Which brings me back to my original question. Will the ebook survive in all its ephemerality, with all its ironic inconveniences, with everybody fighting over it? Who can say, really? Ultimately, it's up to readers. I guess it's up to us to decide. Now, on the plane coming over, I read not Pride and Prejudice, but I did read sort of an equivalent called Swamplandia on my smartphone. I saw older people reading on Kindles and iPads, and I saw young people reading novels in paperback. To me, all this is good for reading and good for the book. That's all.